Hello Chris, thank you very much indeed for joining Green Borders. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
Chris Head, producer, director and comedy tutor.
Yes, hello.
Our first question today is, how did you get involved in comedy?
Well, I was kind of doing comedy from a very young age without realising it. In infant school, we were asked to write on a Monday a story of what we did over the weekend, and I would always write a funny one. Wasn't true, just made up. I think I was influenced by Tom and Jerry at the time. It was lots of me and my brother falling downstairs, hitting each other with frying pans, all kind of craziness. And the teacher would quite often get me to read it to the rest of the class, most of whom were writing quite straightforward things. You know, we went to the swings and ate some biscuits and that kind of thing. And I'm writing, you know, we jumped into a swimming pool and wrestled frogs and hit each other and all this kind of madness. So she would get me to read them out and people would laugh, well, the kids would laugh. So I was kind of doing comedy then without really knowing that I was doing comedy, and it continued through my schooling. Whenever we had to do a talk or a presentation, to the annoyance of the teachers, I would just always do a funny one by default. And then when I was around 16, I became aware of the Young Ones, the whole alternative comedy thing, Saturday Live, Friday Night Live, and suddenly discovered that kind of being funny could be a job. You know, because of course I would love the Two Ronnies and all of that stuff, but never thought that was something I could do. That was just something that was out there, you know, miles away, that you just enjoyed. But kind of seeing people like Ben Elton and Rick Mail and, you know, Ade Edmondson and French and Saunders, people like that doing it, I thought, okay, so this is something new, and maybe I could be doing as well.
Which comedy do you like?
Well, I like all sorts of comedy, really. I have a particular soft spot for Fry and Laurie. They came up in that same era, of course, as the whole alternative comedians, and they were worried because they felt like they were a bit of a throwback. You know, the years of Oxbridge dominance from Peter Cook to Monty Python onwards, they felt like that was over, and all these thrusting young alternative comedians were taking over, and they thought they were just too late. But in fact, there was a place for them, nevertheless. And I first saw them on, you know, Friday Live, Saturday Night Live, those shows, and just loved them, loved the intelligence, loved the wordplay. So yeah, they were real favourites of mine.
Does a comedian have to be inspired, or can he be his own individual personality?
Don't quite understand the question. Do you want to try and rephrase it?
Yeah, for sure. For instance, Ben Elton. Does a comedian perhaps, can he be inspired by Ben Elton, but also be his own individual?
Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Yeah. So when comedians start out, very often they are inspired by someone and they're trying to be like someone. But eventually they find their own voice and they find their own way of doing things. So it's not a bad idea starting out trying to be like existing comedians. But John Cleese's advice for would-be sketch writers is to try and write out a comedy sketch they love from memory, and then compare what they've written to the actual thing, and seeing where it's different and working out why it's different and trying to understand what the original sketch was doing. So that's kind of literally trying to write like your heroes to start with, but you kind of do enough of that and then you start to find your own way.
What makes people laugh?
Well, there are lots of things that make people laugh. One thing that makes people laugh is when something very serious and very trivial are brought together unexpectedly. So, for example, something like the X Factor, you know, in the scheme of things, is relatively trivial. And say the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is quite serious. So if you bring those two things together, that's potentially funny. You know, so trying to resolve the conflict through song, for example. You know. And so those ideas of bringing trivial things and serious things together, or kind of what I call big things and small things, big, small, that makes people laugh. If you have that in mind and watch comedy, you'll find quite a lot of comedy is big, small comedy. So that makes people laugh. Other things that make people laugh are sudden changes. So when something sounds like it's going to be serious and then it becomes very trivial and stupid. So, you know, there's a big build-up and then it's switches, or when your assumptions about a situation are turned on its head. So something starts up or something's being said and you assume one thing and then something else happens that you didn't expect. So having your assumptions challenged, the unexpected, but also what makes people laugh, famously of course is laughs of recognition. When a comedian nails something and they get something just right, when they epitomise something, they get the absolute epitome of something. That kind of rightness of it makes people laugh. But another thing that makes people laugh is when things are wrong, when they're incongruous, when something bizarre is in place of what you would normally expect. The incongruity makes people laugh. So that's a bit of a whirlwind tour of a few different things that make people laugh.
And what makes a great comedian?
Well, I think likability is a big part of it. You have to like a comedian. You can't laugh with someone that you don't like. So all comedians, no matter how dark and nasty, you have to like them if you're going to laugh. So someone like Jimmy Carr might, on the face of it, be, well, to some people anyway, quite hard to like, because he's so extreme and he's so dark and he's quite smoothie and smarmy and condescending. So he's kind of, for some people, he's quite hard to like. But people who laugh at him do like him, nevertheless. But someone like Michael McIntyre is kind of easy to like, so more people are willing to laugh at him because he's easier to like. So likability is key, really. You'll never find a great comedian that nobody at all kind of just likes on a personal level. It's impossible to go, well, I really hate them, but I do laugh. You have to like them. So likability. Also, something else that I think makes a great comedian is their tapping into a character type that we recognise. So Sarah Millican, who's come up recently, you can see that she's capturing a character type that everyone already recognises. John Cleese, for example, he's a character type that people recognise, and Hancock was, and there are comedians who do lots of characters, like Alan Partridge, for example. Steve Coogan, who does Alan Partridge, he does lots of characters, Steve Coogan. But his really popular one is Alan Partridge, and that is kind of the one that most captures a type that we recognise. And that's really the character that people want to see him doing. So there is something about, that recognition. And if you are a character comic like Steve Coogan that does a lot of different characters, and Harry Enfield was one as well, if each of your characters has that recognition factor, there's a type, we go, oh yeah, well, I know that kind of person, then that's what makes a successful comedian, really.
Does bad language have a role in comedy?
Yeah, bad language definitely has a fucking role in comedy, for sure.
Okay.
Well it does, yeah.
Right.
I mean, you can be funny without bad language.
Right.
And so it's not mandatory. And there are a lot of funny comedians who don't swear much. So Milton Jones just comes to mind as a comedian who doesn't swear particularly. But bad language is kind of naturally funny. I mean, you just laughed then when I swore, So kind of swearing in a calculated way, as I did then, can be funny. And for some comedians, it really suits their style. Particularly angry comedians, for example, it really suits their style, and it's kind of part of the rhythm of it. So bad language has to be there, but not all comedians have to swear, and maybe some comedians swear too much, But
do you think comedy should have censorship?
Well, no. That's the great thing about comedy. And obviously, when comedy goes on TV, there is censorship. But if you're talking live comedy, the great thing about live comedy is someone has an idea, they go up on stage, and then they just say it. Nobody is checking in advance what they're going to say in a comedy club. So there is no censorship, and there shouldn't be censorship. But where the kind of barometer of what's acceptable comes in is the audience's reaction. The audience determine what's acceptable and what isn't. And that can change from night to night, from audience to audience. For some audiences in some places it's acceptable, but the same material for a different audience in a different place is not acceptable. And so it's the audience who determine in live comedy what's acceptable and what isn't. And so there shouldn't be anyone before the audience trying to second guess the audience. It should just be down to the audience.
And what's the biggest stage for a comedian?
The biggest what?
The biggest stage, like the Wembley. What's the biggest stage for a comedian?
Well, in terms of live comedy, the first big stopping off point for a comedian is the Comedy Store. All comedians want to play the Comedy Store in Leicester Square. So it's probably not as cutting edge as it once was, but it still is the best comedy club in the country, and it's a real feather in your hat if you can play the Comedy Store at a professional level. With a bit of patience and getting through the gong show and stuff, you can get an open spot at the Comedy Store, but to be a professional comic playing the Comedy Store is hard, and they're very exacting about what they want. So that is, when a comedian can play the Comedy Store, they feel like they made it. But then, of course, now comedy is kind of a multi-million-pound business, And on the next level up, I think the Hammersmith Apollo is a big kind of comedy stage. Comedians would be happy to play there. And then, the O2 Arena, and it goes on really. It's kind of quite crazy now. But on the club level, Comedy Store, but also there are other places like the Stand in Edinburgh and Glasgow, kind of north of the border. That would be a place that comedians would really want to play.
And what advice would you give some budding comedians to get on the ladder of entertainment?
Well, the advice for any aspiring comedian is to start doing it really, but to start doing it in front of audiences, because that's when you learn. You can write scripts in your bedroom for a long time and you can learn a certain amount, but you don't really learn until you start getting an audience reaction to them. So for any budding comedian, I would say get in front of an audience as soon as possible. But in the first stages, that could just be your friends, your first audience could be your friends. So whatever it is that you've written, you could get a bunch of friends together and just do it in your sitting room or something, and there's an audience. But then at some point you've got to get out on the comedy circuit and find real audiences. But that's when you start to learn really, by being in front of an audience.
And have you got any projects you want to share with Green Borders, Chris?
Yeah, actually, just on the previous question, what would I say to a budding comedian? I should take the opportunity to plug my courses.
Sure.
I would say do a comedy course.
Right.
I would do a comedy course, yeah. I mean, you don't have to, but it can really help. And it was kind of a safe environment to try stuff out. And it can give you a lot of insights, and it can put you several steps ahead of someone who just starts from cold. So, yeah, do one of my comedy courses.
And we'll get some information from your website.
Yeah, just Google Chris Head, and then you'll find all the stuff, yeah.
Okay.
Go on, what was the next question?
And my question was, I think you've answered it, but who are your favourite comedians?
Okay, let's think. Who do I really like? I really like Sean Locke. Liked him for a long time. When I was at university about 15 years ago, I used to make a point of going out and seeing Sean Locke. Harry Hill I used to really like in that era as well. So obviously I like the slightly more off-the-wall things. But I really like Doug Stanhope, Bill Hicks, these kind of very political American comedians. Stephen Wright, brilliant American off-the-wall joke writer. One of his jokes I really like, which I'm going to get slightly wrong, but I'll tell it anyway, is I have a microwave fireplace. It means I can sit in front of the fire for an evening in 3 minutes.
Very good.
It's nice. And
very good.
Jimmy Carr I do actually like, a brilliant joke writer. And the aforementioned Sarah Millican I like, Victoria Wood from another era, French and Saunders, Vic and Bob, Farrell Laurie, who I mentioned, Python, of course, classically, Spike Milligan going back, Jonathan Miller, Peter Cook, Beyond the Fringe, those kind of guys, Peter Cook sort of massively really, and more. If I'm vain enough to watch this interview on your site, which I am vain enough to do, I'll go, why didn't I mention that comedian? Or why didn't I mention this comedian? But there's a few anyway.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Chris.
Yeah.
Do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you for joining Green Borders.
Excellent. Cheers.